Sociology, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again in part 2.1. And I thought it might be nice to start with kind of a meta arc on the entire kind of theory of sociology that we find in belonging again. Following part 1 talks about a psychohistoric analysis that Philip Reeve said at the end of Triumph to the Therapeutic was needed, and we can say that part 1 is that psychohistoric analysis. And part 2 would be addressing that analysis. But I think also, before we get into the actual introduction of part 2, we might have kind of a analysis of what almost could be called the meta arc of the entire theory of sociology that is at play in belonging again, because there's a way in which we are arguing that sociology has not been done in a funny way, that it's not the analysis as a field has been done, but not really a tragic sociology as a trade-off of competing goods, which we'll talk about. I spoke with Owen about, and the reason for this is because the entire problem of pluralism and other really arose in the 1830s, 1840s, right when capital kind of races in to hide the problem. But the problem and the need for an analysis, a tragic sociology, is now with us. And so we're going to be talking about some ideas that come up, maybe not always in part 2.1, but 2.2. I spoke a bit with Forrest Landry and Michelle Bowens at Voicecraft on some of the Tocqueville, a little Mary Douglas. So we're going to be talking about that and how it all suggests the need for a tragic sociology today, and how that hopefully becomes clearer here in part 2. I would say a lot of my interest in sociology really started with The Triumph of the Therapeutic with Philip Reeve. And in that book, or when really I started to see that, sociology can be different than just simply fighting power, social justice. Not that sociology, even when you take Reeve with Givens and Releases, and the other book like Freud on civilization and its discontents, because Philip Reeve was such a big Freud scholar. These things clearly have something to do with justice, clearly have something to do with power, and so on and so forth. But we're getting into something much more structural, something much more tragic. A book that has influenced my thinking a lot, noticing that word tragedy that comes up often, is The Fragility of Goodness by Martha Nussbaum. And what he talks about in that book is how when you go back to, say, ancient Greece, you look at the plays of Sophocles, Euripides, etc., you see that the plays are very tragic in the sense that they're trade-offs of competing goods. You either serve the gods, or you serve family, you serve man, you serve freedom, or you serve equality, and you cannot have both. Martha will talk a lot on the play, particularly of Hecuba, which is quite extraordinary, on the problem of trust, and how if we can't trust other people, we can't have a civilization. That's a remarkable play. But anyway, what Martha Nussbaum basically wants to argue in that book is that the plays existed to teach people the character and quality of democracy and society, Athenian democracy versus Iona democracy. And that's the idea that the government always is making trade-offs, that there is no perfect society, there is no solution for everything, we're always dealing with trade-offs. And the argument is that if the arts don't teach the people this, then they're going to have expectations of what the government should do in terms of solutions to their problems. And when that never occurs, they'll get upset and revolt. And so the arts were teaching a certain way that life was, and that is tragic, trade-offs of competing goods. That doesn't mean you can't have any comedia, happy endings, but it is to say that society is fundamentally tragic and government is fundamentally tragic. And a way to think about society or sociology is you're always dealing with managing tragedy, managing trade-offs, and getting people to be comfortable with those trade-offs and to feel like those trade-offs are worth it. If your people in a society feel, one, if they first think that the world composes of problems and solutions, then you're screwed. You're in huge trouble because you'll never solve everything, so they'll rebel. But then at the same time, if you tell them, well, life isn't fair, there are some injustices, there are some imperfections, but we're going to do our best. Well, right there, that could just be a rumor or propaganda that is told to make people passive and accept the power structure, right? And yet there's truth to that. This is the issue. So how do you convince people that tragedy is not a doctrine of taking advantage of people, but an ontological reality and that the government is doing its best? A way to think about sociology is the conditions necessary to make it plausible to people that the state is doing the best that they can with tragedy, and that the community is doing the best that it can with tragedy, that families are doing the best, that everyone is doing the best that they can given the reality of tragedy. Another way to think of it, if we take the Heideggerian technological essence as a reality of problems and solutions. If we have a problem, we just need the right tool or technology to fix it, right? And I know there are distinctions in Heidegger's between like technology, technique, and tool, and so on. Wine, where the grapes unveil their being in the wine, versus the river wine that is just standing reserve, and that's quite interesting in Heidegger. But anyway, the notion is that you could kind of say that the technological essence of today is almost the opposite of sociology as the managing of trade-offs in tragedy. We could say technology that is leading to the singularity is a rejection of tragedy. And also you could say that that's another reason why in the capital form, the commodity form that Marx talks about, there's a kind of rejection of tragedy in that. Because we don't have to make trade-offs because we can make everything the same. And if everything's the same, there's no tragedy. There's no trade-offs. Everything is fungible. Everything is worth $20. And so the commodity form works against tragedy. And then capitalism itself is a kind of, you have a problem, we'll solve it. We'll get rid of the problem, and so on and so forth. And so there's a logic of capital that is the logic of technology, which is the logic of problems and solutions, which is a commedia, which is a kind of myth of commedia, a myth of a happy ending in the sense of we'll overcome everything. Now, this doesn't mean happiness. It just depends on what we mean by it is a bad thing. But it does mean that happiness, there's something about perhaps the human desire, the natural desire to avoid tragedy that contributes to a misunderstanding of what sociology is, which is the study of tragedy or the social structures of dealing with tragedy that lead to politics. And you could say that sociology as such exists in a kind of tension with the commodity form. And then it becomes very confusing once the commodity form or capital begins to infringe upon sociology. So we could say to start that there's something about sociology and technology that exist as kind of opposites. Now, I don't want to push that too far because you can, of course, have a sociology of technology or so on and so forth, but we're talking in terms of their relation to problems or relations to reality. Technology seems to be on the side of problems and solutions, where sociology, in its proper sense for me, is on the sides of managing trade-offs. Now, Philip Rieff, in The Triumph of the Therapeutic, talks about the need for a psychohistorical analysis for how we arose to the world we're in. Now, his book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, is really kind of talking about how the human being, to really be optimal, needs both givens and releases, is how I describe it. Now, he talks about releases and constraints. I think that was a mistake. Well, I don't know if I want to say mistake, but I think it made his argument miss some of what it was getting at. In a given, let's just say you're born in a Christian civilization. It is thus given that Christ rose from the dead, or something like that. Whereas a release would be, you can question if God rose from the dead. You no longer have to believe it. And you see, the thing is, where you have, this is what Belonging in Part 1 will really emphasize, where there are givens, there's existential stability. It's easier to trust the people around you because you generally know what they think. There's less what's called meta-mentality, where you're always wondering what other people think and they think you think, and so on and so forth. You don't have the legitimization crisis, and you don't also destroy the trance of believability, which is a play on James Wood. But this all comes with the risk of the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about. And what's so critical about that idea is it is not saying that evil is boring, but that evil becomes everyday, becomes thoughtless, not stupid, but mechanical, automatic. And so, funny enough, there's something about givens that actually aligns with the technological essence, and yet it is also something that has to do with roots. So this would also suggest that it is not merely freedom from givens that unleashes technology, but actually the very formal structure of givens that we have to think anew, ergo the address. Anyway, the point is that the banality of evil has a certain thoughtlessness to it that can risk Nazism, racism, xenophobia, and so on and so forth. All right, so you release people, you free them, you tear down social norms, you liberate the individual from social expectations. And Philip Reeve says we live in the age of the triumph of the therapeutic, and this would all be therapeutic, the freedom from repression. Well, the issue with that is it can existentially overwhelm people, because now there's infinite possibility, and if you can choose X and Y and Z equally, and you choose X, why did you choose X and not Z? And what if your neighbors think that you made a bad choice? So you get existentially overwhelmed. And when people are existentially overwhelmed, ironically, they then can turn to strong men in order to deal with their anxiety, and that's what's happening today. So this is kind of Philip Reeve's point, is sure, givens can lead to fascism, but removing givens can as well. You have to somehow, you can't deal with the problem of the banality of evil and totalitarianism by simply removing the sociological givens. That can lead to the thoughtlessness of it, because doing so can existentially overwhelm people and make them return to it, or they atomize. They can no longer relate. There's a collapse of social relatability, and I think this was reflected in collapsing birth rates. People don't know the terms by which to interact. And also we have a collapsing, we don't really know a doctrine of forgiveness. That's a big kind of idea at Belonging Again too. And I know Nina yesterday at Philosophy Portal was talking about that. We'll talk about Agnes Callard. We'll talk about the book on the sunflower, etc. And so what ends up, because here's the issue, when you free people from givens, then you have to make up for the lack of social organization by givens with negotiations. People have to talk and figure out how they're going to live together. Talking is hard. People tend to be bad at it. They hurt each other's feelings. And then they don't want to interact with people anymore. And so that leads to all sorts of issues. So what ends up happening is Philip Reeve is suggesting to us that basically sociology today, and merely being on the side of the therapeutic releasement, is not even sociology anymore. Because sociology, well, this would be me, this is what I would argue based on the tragic sociology that I like to talk about, is that it's actually just a triumph of the therapeutic, which that's a kind of means, that ultimately means that sociology is on the side of technological essence. It has become its opposite, and thus it is pathological, and thus the use of it is questionable. Because if sociology is simply going to contribute to making everything free, quote unquote, from restraint, that's what the technological essence does. That's what capital does. And so then sociology that might critique capitalism and critique capitalism is actually in service of it. It's in service of the same formal logic, form, in a classical Aristotelian Platonic sense, formal, and thus it is no longer part of the address. And so we have to get back to what is sociology, and sociology is a management of tragedy, of trade-offs. We have to somehow maintain a human subject that has both givens and releases. It has to have definition, but also freedom. But here's the problem, those by definitions tend to cancel one another out. And the only way we've really dealt with the problem is through sociological conditions that no longer apply. Now, a way to think about this, because I'll talk about tragic sociology like I did with Owen and Raymond and so on. So we have this overarching idea that sociology has something to do as an opposite with technological essence, as a managing of trade-offs. All right, well, if we go back, we look at, say, E.O. Wilson's The Social Dominance of Reality, or something like that. Social Conquest of Reality. He asks a very interesting question. He asks, why didn't dolphins take over the world? Dolphins are really smart. There's no reason that human beings necessarily should be kind of the dominant being on the planet. And what he points out is a few things. So one, he says humans have thumbs. That's important because we can grab tools and then ask questions about them. We have brains, that matters, but here's the interesting one. He says we could make campfires, and by campfires we could gather. Dolphins can't make fires. Humans can, so they can gather around a fireplace, and then that creates a network effect, and so on and so forth. So the key is that socialization, the ability to socialize, and institutions of social possibility lead to the network effect of the human mind that, then you have intellectual kind of multiplication and exponentiation and so on and so forth. So the campfire is a really big deal. Now, I like to take E.O. Wilson and connect with another extraordinary sociologist that John David got me on, called How Institutions Think by Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas is fascinating because he's trying to ask the question on, is it possible to have an individual who is capable of intellectualizing, who can kind of think? And what he points out, to really sum up this incredible book, is that there's a problem of intellect, of category, that requires institutions to give authority to certain categories versus others, or otherwise thinking would not be possible. So let me explain. It's actually kind of tied to the Marx issue on how is a pencil and a cup going to relate? Like, how would they relate with one another? Well, prices, right? You know, there's a category of price that makes them relate. They're worth $5. Thus, the cup that's $20 is worth 4 pence or something, right? But you see, those are kind of categorizations. There are natures of categorization, and how do some categories have authority versus others? Like, let's take the category cup, or the category car, or boy, or girl, you know, teacher, so on. There are all these categories. All human thought requires categorization, which one makes them prone to, you could even say fascism if you wanted. You know, that kind of makes me think of Guattari and everyone wants to be a fascist, and it's true because the structures of thought have that. And maybe you could even bring in, although again I'm no expert on Levinas, but I always understand Levinas' warning that there's something about the structures of language and thought that tend toward totality. And Mary Douglas, I think, would agree, and she'd be like, yes, but categories are necessary for humans to relate. And here's the issue. There is no similarity, doesn't exist in nature. There is not, two things are not the same. Similarity is always a judgment. I judge these two things as the same because there are cups, right? So I judge two cups as the same. But there is no cupness in reality. There's just two objects that I see a form, and I say, these are cups. I judge similarity. Okay, but my neighbor comes along and says, I don't judge similarity. I don't see anything there. And so we can't exist together. So institutions come along and you require them to determine what categorizations have authority versus not. And without institutions to say, yes, the category of cup is a valid category and it is useful and we're going to believe that judgment of similarity is authoritative. Without that, then you can't have people live together, or you can't have social intelligibility. People aren't going to get along. So you have to have institutions to deal with the problem of categorization, authoritative categorization, without which thinking is not possible, let alone collective thinking. So here's the issue. The fire, if you will, which of course, you know, I'm no expert on evolutionary history or anything, but if we take E.O. Wilson as at least a mythos, which it seems to have some legitimacy to it, which would also suggest that, you know, it's a kind of popular notion, rather we go all the way back to Quinn's Ismail or Diamond, that agriculture was a massive mistake. Well, there's something about agriculture versus hunter-gathering that allows network effects and collective intelligence and greater intellect. Now, are we happier because of it? Well, you know, that's a different matter. But I think it's always contingent. It's always open-ended, following Hegel. But anyway, so the idea is you have the campfire and you have the network effect. But in order to keep that network effect going as you get more and more complicated minds, then you need authoritative categories. And this is where institutions or even priests or like authority figures come in. Authority comes into existence to deal with the problem of intelligibility. But of course now, and without intelligibility, you can't have network effects. But now we have an issue. We have now introduced power. We have now introduced institutions. And this is where we are now at risk. But if they don't exist, then we have the problem of not being able to create social intelligibility. Another way to think of this is every civilization, I think Jonathan Haidt mentioned this in his book on the righteous mind, every civilization has the problem of making a many a one. Every civilization has to figure out how to make many people a single nation, a single people, right? Well, that right there risks oppression because you could force the many into a one. But if you don't, then you don't have a nation, you don't have a people. And so we can say what Mary Douglas is getting at as part of the issue of making a many to one. And you start that by making authoritative categories, which you need institutions for. And so you're trying to make a many and a one. Now, here's the rub, though. It is easier to make a many into a one the less diverse people, the more similar they are, because there's always going to be some degree of diversity because there's no such thing as similarity. But if everyone is Christian, yeah, there might be Methodists, there might be Baptists, and so on and so forth, but the difference is contained. It's not as varied. And so you can hold people together, and there's probably not going to be as much debate over the categories. Now, this, of course, is going to be to the detriment of, say, minorities or people who are different. But the point is that When people are very similar, authority and power doesn't feel as oppressive because it's there, but you don't oppose it as much because you simply think according to the axioms and givens like the power structure. So yes, the categories are reinforced by power, but the categories don't feel like you're fenced in. It's more like you're a cow in the middle of a field and you don't see the fences, to come. It's free range versus oppression. And so when you have societies that are similar, they are experienced by the people more according to free range versus oppression. Now, the issue is, as you diversify, though, and as the world becomes more complex, trade routes and so on and so forth, then the more and more people are going to start realizing, wait a minute, my categories are different from the categories of the Mongolians or the Japanese. Wow, there is difference. And that draws into question the authority of your categories. And once that occurs, then you start going, well, wait a minute, I'm a prisoner to these categories or these givens. Why should I listen to them? And then people say, well, because our nation defeated all the bad guys, or our nation follows God, or our nation is the king, whatever follows the king, etc., etc. You come up with myths or stories or social contracts or philosophical basis to deal with the problem. And this and this can work for a bit until it does not, because you have to look for a way for people to continue to believe in your categories as authoritative, or social intelligibility goes away. But all structures of socialization are doing something with power that could oppress. So you've now got a recipe for rebellion that's problematic. Now, it should be noted in all this that we have to ask the question. This is where Mary Douglas is so interesting, because her argument is that the formation, because he's challenging the rugged individuals, he's challenged for kind of some of these free market ideas. What she wants to argue is that the arising of institutions and authorities for authoritative categories is emergent. It's natural. It's like the arising of power as such is not a product of power, but a product of people trying to understand one another. I think another book that to me is sociologically, it's more anthropological, but sociologically significant. What we have to do is go around the world and look at the case studies of civilizations and how they started from less technological advancement and what occurred. And we look at the a very famous text, Homo Hieroglyphicis by Louis Demande, on the rising of the caste system in India. And what you see over there is that the caste system was not imposed. He's fighting the idea that caste was created by the British, which is a position of the caste of minds of Dirks, I believe. And what he wants to show is, no, the hierarchy arose naturally because it's a psychosocial technology. The caste system is to understand people's positioning. And what you see with the rise of the caste system is that people need to create ways to understand one another, or else they go mad. Now, I think we can think Dirks and Dumont together, and then you can even get into the Law of Manu, the Leiden book, etc. But anyway, the idea is that I think the British came in and then made the caste system solid, and they controlled the Brahmin class, so then they controlled India. But what Demande wants to show is that hierarchy was very fluid, that it was not so solid, and it was really a kind of social psychotechnology to know people's positionings, how they organize. There's a lot of subcastes, so on and so forth. And we can also look at law as tending to be a kind of sense of cause and effect in interacting with society and other people in certain ways. So people had a sense of intelligibility. Actions, we knew what certain actions would lead to what. Categories. And the key is that we see the arising of categorization as such, which often today in the American mind seems very oppressive, but what's very interesting is you see it basically arise naturally, that this is what humans naturally arise to, which again seems necessary to maintain the quote-unquote fireplace, the fire around the fire that E.O. Wilson talks about for the network effect. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you might just engage in dolphin evolution per se. And if there's something about the dolphin that's a disembodied intelligence, a non-social intelligence, although I'm not saying dolphins don't socialize, I'm just kind of thinking metaphorically here, then there's something about the dolphin that leads to the disembodied intelligence of AI. Now that has to be expanded on, but anyway. Another example is if we look at Democracy in America by Tocqueville. And what's interesting in that book is he shows that on the frontier when people didn't have categorization, they didn't have set jobs, their future wasn't set. When they interacted with other people, they actually kind of naturally started to refer to themselves according to the merchant class, simply to kind of defend their vulnerability. Because, if someone asks you, who are you? It's kind of naked. It's a vulnerability. So you start talking about your job and your money and so on and so forth. So people actually then turn to institutions to defend themselves from the other person. And this is just very important because it means that if we're going to talk about liberating people, say from capital or to be who they want to be, well, we see in history that people, when given those conditions, they tend to hide. They tend to actually run because they don't want to confront what you could say is the real. And this is where Lacan and all of the psychoanalysis, I think, is absolutely critical to think the problem of, say, freedom for the individual, which, again, if sociology is about trade-offs between givens and releases, if we're too far on the side of givens now, or power according to capital, then we have to start talking about some sort of liberation of the individual in the terms of restraint. But that's probably going to have something to do with the real, and this is why, for me, Philip Reef leads to psychoanalysis and so on and so forth. So we have examined, and there's more. You can look at, the Volsung saga, like some of the Icelandic literature, history of revenge. I think about exclusion embraced by Vol, etc., etc. You just see that human beings, to deal with the problem of otherness, either kill them or they turn to categories. Ways of defining themselves, but that means they need power. Now, so sociology, I think, has a lot to do with all of that. To me, I also really like the Scottish Enlightenment through a kind of sociological lens, because David Hume, for me, is very fascinating because he's warning about unembedded rationality, or rationality that is based on a non-common life. It is based on a philosophical premise. So, for example, David Hume wants to base the ethical life not on a moral law, but sentiment. Well, why is that? Because for him, sentiment is the experience of your neighbor, and in particularity, and you experience them, right? Whereas a moral law, like you say, the categorical imperative, that applies anywhere on planet Earth at all time. So you don't have to have skin in the game, and you can actually use it as power to oppress other people. The king far away can tell people and how in a small community they should live because, it's the moral law. And so he's very, very concerned. David Hume is very concerned about unembedded philosophy. At the same time, he realizes without philosophy, you can't self-defend yourself from manipulation, or you cannot stop yourself from falling into some kind of banality of evil. So you have this problem with David Hume, this 1700 kind of area. Because what it is you have societies that are now trying to base themselves on an unembedded rationality. And for him, that leads to what he calls, at the beginning of the Treatise of Human Nature, the philosophical melancholia. I think that's basically the meaning crisis. And it's going to lead to power and ultra-violence, because here's the key. And Dr. Donald Livingston, in his masterpiece, talks about this. Once you have society based on non-contingent philosophical premises, totality becomes possible, ergo to totalitarianism and world war. And, you could start talking about dialectics of the Enlightenment at that point with Horkheimer and Adorno, and they kind of link to one another. So, and David Hume sees, and I think all of the counter-Enlightenment people, Scottish Enlightenment people, I know some people don't like the counter-Enlightenment term, but, that's an Isaiah Berlin thing. But it basically is all these people concerned about rationality that is not embedded in experience, actuality, particularity, and so on and so forth, and they think that's going to be unleashed and lead to great destruction. And I think they were right. So now you have this push to return to an embedded rationality. You can even see that in Heidegger, but here's the issue. An embedded rationality could lead to what? Dugin, Alexander Dugin. Everyone has their own, Hume leads to Dugin. And this where in 2016, for me, Hume and all the sociology had to lead into Hegel, and it's a longer story. Or else we ended up with a world of small fascist states, as I remember speaking with Gran and Lorenzo about. So anyway, you have this idea that as the world modernizes, you have rationality becomes increasingly unembedded. which means it is also becoming aware, the subject is becoming aware that the categories that they organize their lives could be different, increasingly so, because they're encountering diversity. And up to this point, for most of human history, people, difference was dealt with basically by isolationism. I mean, there was travel, and people dealt with otherness, unfortunately, through violence or colonialization or other things, right? But as the world develops, the problem of the other is increasingly seen, especially today, as being inadequately addressed by violence, right? But let's look at another thing. So you have, another thing that David Hume is responding to is basically the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution, which is tied to a sociological reality of otherness. You have the religious wars. You have people killing one another. You say, oh my gosh, how are we going to live together? And the idea was, well, we'll base it on science, objectivity, facts, empiricism, and then that will be the basis of reality. And yes, we will be constrained in authoritative categories, but if those are based on empiricism, then people will give up their wants to that empiricism, but it will feel just because it's simply the facts. It's a very fair position of the science. Even to this day, many people hold it, and it's a reasonable proposition because you're looking for, okay, we now exist in an age where people realize their categories of organization givens could be different, and so they feel arbitrary, or they're going to fight for them. How do we unify difference? How do we make a many into a one? And it seemed like science could do that because it seemed outside of subjectivity. But of course, you can't have science without an implicit metaphysics. And also what David Hume understood is that creates power of the scientism. That also creates disembodied rationality because you're separating reality from sentiment, the subject, personhood, the common life. And then, of course, making truest reality facticity. And then, of course, the great Vico is going to be talking all about this, and he understood the pathologies that this could develop. Now, I had a few talks with David and John on Vico. There would be a lot to say in Vico and Foucault, and Hayden White can all be thought together, and then the great Benjamin Fontaine as well. But anyway, scientism also, who controls the facts? There's an information problem as well, because it would assume the possibility of everyone knowing the scientific facts to thus agree to them, and then you get a schooling system. And then, of course, the problem is science cannot provide you a reason to stand against capital, because this is where utilitarianism comes in, the formation of capital markets, economics. In scientism, which then almost by definition has to bracket out questions of the subject, ontology, being, the good life, and leave that up to individuals, well, then that means on the social so that what ends up happening on the macro scale, you're going in the direction of science, which has no way to stop the development of markets. So you do get a conflict maybe between the market and the state, Keynes and Hayek and all of that different stuff, but the implicit metaphysics is assumed behind it, so that implicit metaphysics ultimately prevails, which is the metaphysics of the singularity in Nick Land. And science can't stop that. It can't stop capital. So you have these things in operation, but what's very interesting is when we look at sociology, it doesn't really exist as a term until the 18th. I think Comte is the first one to use the term sociology, and it's the study of society, maybe 1830, 1840. And again, like I said, I think Marx in the Capital, especially chapter 1, is basically a sociologist, but he doesn't have the language, he doesn't have the terms. He's seeing something new before it is well understood as a field of study. So sociology tends to arise, in that period. And what's interesting is sociology, in a way, has always been with us, but because human beings primarily existed in terms of free range, and they weren't interacting with otherness, nor were they an other to themselves, and this is important because alienation makes you an other to yourself if you're alienated by labor, etc., and so forth. But really, the other was not a problem to be managed, if you will. Otherness was a mistake, not something you would have to live with. And I think that shift is very important to understand why sociology emerges at this period of time. And it has a lot to do with the question of Dietrich Maclowski, the Great Enrichment, on industrialization. Like, why in the world is industrialization occurring? And how is society changing when there suddenly is a difference between market in economy or market and society. There's everything is being unembedded, as Carl Planier talks about in The Great Transformation. And so there's this question of how is society changing, which is also a realization that categories are authoritative due to power, and that seems oppressive. And what are we going to do? And so there's a study of all of these soft, invisible mechanisms and how they work to socialize the individual. And how are they good or how are they bad? And this also, funny enough, it arises as a field of study with the fungibility of capital, with everything being turned into $20. And there's a certain magic, a fetish, as Zizek talks about. When you start saying the bookcase is worth $200, what are the sociological conditions that need to be met to convince people that that is in fact worth $20? And here's the key. It has to feel like it is worth $20, not that it might be $20, but that it is $20. So you have to be convinced that there are these kind of objective realities that can't possibly be objective and yet are. And people have to be convinced of that, ergo plausibility structures. You have to create entire societies. So sociology, this is the point. It is not by chance that sociology arises when the process of creating authoritative categories is undeniable. For most of history, it was kind of an invisible process. And also it occurred, well, because, the chieftain told you that Christ was God, the priest told you that Christ was God, but he believed it just as much as you. So he wasn't making, relative to you, he wasn't quote unquote making metaphysics. He was realizing metaphysics. He wasn't creating metaphysics. He was realizing metaphysics per se. And so the process of category creation was not seen as an intentional creation, but a realization. And that's where religion was quite powerful. But what's very interesting is there is no denying, like, people are witnessing the creation of markets. They are witnessing industrialization. They are witnessing and experiencing the advent and emergence of new categories of socialization that had to have been created, and yet at the same time they have to be convinced as they're being created that no, these are being realized. No, things are $20. Well, my gosh, how do you do that? It's like a magic trick, basically. How do you do a magic trick at scale? Industrialization has to do this. And the process, sociology becomes the study of this process, which is ultimately, here's the key, it is also unveiling a tragedy that it also, because at the same time as the development of sociology, you have the spread of the technological essence of problems and solutions. Sociology arises precisely to unveil the tragedy of existence as that is hidden by the spread of capital. So there's this weird, it's emerging and hidden. It vanishes right then and there. You have people seeing, oh my goodness, like new categories of organization are arising, which, by the way, we require to organize. So maybe this isn't so bad. I don't know. And then you don't even ask those questions anymore, because if you're still asking them, they lose authority. So sociology arises and vanishes in a sense. And in that vanishing, there is also a very unfortunate split between economics and sociology and politics that then starts to occur in this period of time. It is a massive mistake to remove the category of political economy from our thinking. So you have sociology that is arising in the questions of the process of socialization, which really until this period was invisible. And yes, people encountered one another on the Silk Road, for example. But what's very interesting is for most of history, pluralism was according to economic exchange, or people meeting one another. But in that, people people who were different could get along because they shared a common language of the commodity good. Or, I want the spices. I have no idea what you believe and I think you're crazy, but I want your salt, you want my pepper, we can get along. So the economics always provides a language, if you will, a way to communicate between difference that without you get into a lot of trouble. Okay, well, never before has really anyone known how to deal with pluralism other than through some sort of economic language. And here's the key, the more and more society, sociologically, entails otherness. Like, Europe is no longer just a Christian nation, and increasingly is, you have Muslims, or you have people with different religious beliefs, Catholics, Protestants. The more there is a pluralization of a single society, the more and more you have the problem of the Silk Road exist domestically. And the more that exists domestically, you're in big trouble, because people who are different don't tend to get along. And so markets came to replace society because nobody knew what else to do. What do you do? So markets came to be very present in people's lives to help them get along and share authoritative categories. Okay, you're a blacksmith, I'm a merchant, I have 20,000, you have 30. These are all authoritative categories that then came to help deal with the problem of difference. And so what you see is what Mary Douglas describes of authoritative categories arising from the institutions primarily of religion has now moved to markets. And I know Shahil at there, was mentioning it's a theory of theology that Marx is putting forth, and it absolutely is, because you need those authoritative categories or people will kill one another. But here's the issue. So basically, what has occurred is sociology became visible as a trade-off of competing goods between givens and releases, categories, many in the one. It became visible precisely when it then was made invisible with markets, because markets dealt with the quote-unquote problem. So, there it goes. And so sociology, then it was a question of, it arose, there's something to study here, but then it's like, well, what exactly are we studying now? Because all I see is markets. You see, there was a sleight of hand, there was an invisibility. Basically, I would like to argue that now there's a real sense in which we're being forced to actually do sociology, because there's a way in which we haven't been intentional about it. We haven't focused on it. We haven't been systematic. We haven't really done sociology in a weird way. Of course, there were birders and hunters and, reefs and et cetera here and there. And, Foucault's interesting as a biographical sketch because he starts on the side of sociology therapeutic, but toward the end of his life, he starts going, oh my gosh, without constraint, without givens, people go mad. And Foucault's a very interesting case study. But anyway, and then some of you could look at your Putmans and Social Capital and Woodhoff and or Wolin. I think Sheldon Wolin actually on Tocqueville is quite good. But anyway, so basically markets came to deal with the problem of difference. And yeah, that worked, but there's a few problems here. Markets work by unembedding, which is what Carl Planier talks about, or making everything fungible. Well, what did we learn from David Hume? If you make the basis of society non-contingent or fungible or not grounded in a common life, well, then you have the problem of totalization. And what, of course, has capital done? It's totalized. It's tried to make the whole world in the image and likeness of capital. Which, again, please note, if we don't have a way to address the problem of pluralism, this is not a bad thing. What else are we going to do? We're probably just going to kill one another. And you could argue, what you see is the modern society you have, if you want to, every society basically in the world today is based on philosophical doctrines that for David Hume are auto-cannibalistic. Even if you look at something like World War I, World War II, Axis allies, or just, World War I actually is a really important case study, Guns of August, kind of this argument of how people under pluralism, here's the issue, people who are very different from one another can just kind of stumble into World War now and not even mean to. And I think it's very important that World War II probably doesn't happen without World War I, and there's no Cold War without World War II, et cetera, et cetera. So basically the entire 20th century is a product of World War I. Now that's a massive claim, but I think it's actually fair, and actually it's pretty remarkable then if World War I was kind of stumbled into. And David Hume and some of the other people would be like, of course it was stumbled into, because people can't stop the development of an unembedded thought once it begins rolling. And once it begins rolling, it starts getting a life of its own. It gets a logic of its own. World War I could be the first Moloch trap that people talk about now with AI. Well, that was World War I as a product of unembedded rationality in philosophies and social contracts and ideas of how to run the world that can't stop themselves once they get going. And then once they get going, it's too late. It's the Kafka little fable and the Nash equilibrium game theory. And I think Kafka is the best thinker of these problems. But anyway, that sort of inability to stop the unfolding of a quote-unquote rationality that is unembedded is what becomes possible starting in the 1830s. That arose precisely because of the need to create a many of the one or to have diversity relate to one another. So dealing with the problem of diversity led to an unembedded rationality that made possible totality, and in making totality made possible Nash equilibria on a global scale that could not be stopped. Because you need that embeddedness and you need alternative logics. And we're still in this problem. And I would argue ultimately unembeddedness is dolphin evolution per se, which is the singularity of Nick Land. So what we have now is, you could say, the meaning crisis, nihilism, meta crisis. All of these are what follow from a world that has not taken sociology as tragedy seriously, which there's a very real sense in which we have not had to. But it turns out that markets cannot address the inherent tragedy of sociology. Markets can simply hide that tragedy from you. It can distract you from it. And it works for a time, but then World War I happens. Then the singularity, disembodied meaning crisis, fungibility, the loss of time energy. And here's the other thing, like with the time energy. Basically, you cannot have time energy. You will not have large blocks of repeatable, useful time, high energy time, unless you globally figure out how to deal with the problem of the many as the one, the problem of pluralism, the problem of otherness, outside of the logic of capital. That would be because people in their freedom throughout history, when they deal with one another, are overwhelmed by the real. Time energy requires a subjectivity that has been trained to maintain embeddedness and diversity and difference while not being overwhelmed by the difference of the other. So it becomes very psychoanalytical, and it becomes, one would have to think the human becoming versus the human being to allude to the move from Aristotle to Hegel, as Cadell mentioned in his recent video, over at Voicecraft. And I think this does have a lot to do with Voicecraft. Word spread, medium condition, McLuhan, William Ong, etc., so forth. Anyway, in the classroom as a moving from the trivia model anyway, because you have to create conditions of becoming, because you can't deal with the problem of the many and the one when you're dealing with the human being versus the human becoming. Anyway, so for me, sociology, there's a very real sense in which sociology, the real sociology, as a trade-off of competing goods, of figuring out how to create conditions of trade-offs between givens and releases. You have to have some level of socialization, but not so much that you oppress. You need freedom, but not so much you're overwhelmed. A creating conditions of processing and developing like a garden. These are all the things that sociology has to do, because another way to look at sociology is the study of the possibility of culture as distinct from market. But you see, culture distinct from market means will only be maintained if people understand that the world is not perfect, that we're dealing with trade-offs of competing goods, and we can't solve all our problems. We as human beings just have to live together and work through them. We have to live with our problems, which is also the potential of motivation and having a work that's distinct from toil, a leisure that is deep and meaningful versus a leisure that is lazy. But we have to own that, and a commons, a community, a space of community distinct from markets will never last in a world where people want to solve all their problems, because you can't solve all the problems. And so they'll then bring in markets. The markets will replace the commons and community. We'll go back to the neoliberal, ergo artificial intelligence wins. So sociology is the study or the understanding of the tragic character of human reality that must be understood by the individual subjects so that they can exist in a place of community and not seek to solve its problems in a manner that results in the commons being lost or replaced or abandoned because it's simply too painful to be around people. And you see that kind of psychoanalytical understanding of what the subject today needs to be done, I think, can be seen if we look at sociology as this psychohistorical process. We think of sociology not as freedom of the individual, but the equipping of the individual to handle and to thrive in the context of tragedy, because tragedy is precisely the context of a work that gives us something to do, to work with and live with and dwell in that tragedy, and to then defend it from market forces that would seek to tempt us with a solution to that tragedy through reductionism, flattening, and alienation. Sociology should be in the business of teaching us to know better and to fight for where we dwell and to maintain it on these terms. And so that's, to me, what I think about when I think about sociology. And Belonging, again, part one hopefully outlines that. And Belonging Again, Part 2, would then address what exactly would be the social condition needed today so that all of this can be realized, so that we can return to the place of our beginnings, this sociology that was overlooked, and know it for the first time, as Mr. Eliot would say in Little Gidding, where we can perhaps be in a place where the fire and rose are one and neither is consumed, to be the kind of subjects that can hold that rose and find dwelling in it.